Am I getting amplified here at all? People can hear me? Okay, excellent. My name is John Aubert. I teach in the geography department over in the science area, and I've been here about 20 years or so at American River College. This is my colleague, Lynn Fowler, who is in counseling and has been with the district for longer than you've been with ARC.
Almost 18
Okay,
years.
yeah. So we both saw Professor Phil Smith's invitations to come and talk about this issue amongst faculty and employees because we're interested and concerned about misinformation and about how information is used. And we, in particular, found that our expertise and our interests lay in looking at science, looking at the misuse of science, trying to understand what the difference is between science and pseudoscience. I want to say that in terms of the different examples that I'm going to present, I'm not a broad expert in the entirety of the realm of sciences, but I'm going to bring my own unique perspective. Lynn is going to bring her perspective, maybe to some degree more so in the social sciences. My background in geography and interest is in physical geography, which has some crossovers with geology, geosciences, environmental sciences. And so when we do hit the time for questions, we want you to ask questions. We want you to be inquisitive. And so, yeah, I think that we'll jump in. I got to figure out how I'm going to juggle my pointer, so that works there. And no, I think I'll be good. I think I'll be good. And as what we're going to do is kind of tandem. I'm going to go first. I'm going to turn it over at some point to Lynn, but she may jump in when I'm talking. She may then defer to me when she's talking, but we definitely want to try to leave time for questions. Just some simple definitions, and I don't want to spend a lot of time with this. We'll find a way to post this or provide this to anybody who wants it. So if you're taking notes, I don't want you to freak out if I continue past this slide. But what is the definition of science? And this is a classic dictionary definition. The systematic, that's important, study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. Observation, the gathering of data, the gathering of information, of evidence, ultimately to support some sort of conclusion. So what is pseudoscience? Again, this is sort of a classic dictionary definition, collection of beliefs or practices mistakenly regarded as being based on the scientific method. And one thing I would add is that possibly purposefully used at some points to deceive. And I don't know that that is quite encompassed in this definition. So I want to take us through, and let me say right out, if I offend anybody by calling your deeply held beliefs pseudoscience, I apologize. That is not my intent. In many cases, I want to make a distinction between exploring the world using, quote unquote, the scientific method and trying to understand and explore the world in different ways. So what I'm going to do, I think in my slides, is kind of show a series of images that'll give you a hint of some of the things I'm going to comment on. So here's a little cartoon. I hate the term anti-vax. It's so negative. Well, how about pro-disease? What do you think our most powerful renewable resource is? Denial. Maybe a commentary on climate change denial. Don't tell the flat earthers about this. We'd never hear the end of it. Yeah, and that's one that I really have a hard time with. But we'll talk about it and try to be reasonable about it and look at science versus pseudoscience. And again, any fans of Dr. Oz, I'm not attacking your beliefs, and I'm not saying that Dr. Oz or Vani Hari the Food Babe or David Avocado Wolf don't have ideas that people take and employ in their lives that aren't useful. Maybe they are, but I want to try to make the distinction between science and pseudoscience. And in fact, he did say that. I saw the video clip. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, but again, maybe maybe I took it out of context. So let's take a further look. Oh, and then another one of my favorites. I don't know how popular these are these days, but about a decade ago, this company was making tens of millions of dollars on their performance technology, you can see here. And so we'll take a little look at that. They also got sued and had to pay out tens of millions of dollars for being deceptive. Rather than sort of try to coldly go through the scientific method, I'm going to try to present what I call, when I talk to my classes, some fundamentals of modern scientific inquiry. And then in parentheses, I put the rules. Well, there's no real keepers of the rules, but there is rigorous scientific inquiry. And then when we get to the edges, sometimes it's less rigorous. And arguably, at some point, it becomes non-science or pseudoscience or speculation or other approaches. So it is where data and information is collected to formulate conclusions as opposed to the other way around. Sometimes people have their conclusions and then they seek evidence to selectively seek evidence to try to support those. Must be consistent with previously accepted science. You can't disregard gravity. You can't... I'm sorry, it's a toxin. You can't call gravity a toxin off the top of your head. You can't disregard the laws of thermodynamics or claim magic, miracles, supernatural powers, etc. And again, I am not attacking anybody for their beliefs or their faith in, for instance, miracles. I want to put that into a reasonable, fair context. But professional expert scientists in whatever field they are endeavoring to study don't gather a lot of data and go through it and run experiments and then say, boom, it was a miracle. That is generally not science. Must be repeatable and verifiable. You know, my simple way of explaining this is you have to be able to show others. You have to allow your science to be openly criticized, to be looked at, to be examined by others, ideally other experts. Must be willing, and this is a tough one even for scientists. This is a tough one even for scientists. You have to be willing to completely disregard whatever you thought about the world through experimentation and observation and accept a new conclusion if you're presented with the evidence. And when an endeavor goes against this, chances are it might more reasonably be called non-science, politely, or some other endeavor, or pseudoscience. And again, also in general, people will say that modern professional science is progressive. It continues to ask new questions, as opposed to, in this case, a laser focus on attacking conclusions that you don't like. If that's the only science you're conducting, it is questionable as to whether it's science. Or, a preoccupation with only one very narrow issue, again, something that you might just personally disagree with. This is a graphic that says some of the things I just said in a slightly different way. I pulled this. I can provide at a later date the reference. I don't have it up here. But again, this is reframing in much of what I just said, willingness to change with new evidence rather than having your ideas be fixed. They say ruthless peer review. Pseudoscience often has no peer review. And let me say for students in the room, professional science in the modern age involves generally submitting your work to professional journals, in which case they farm it out to other experts and professionals in the field to examine your data collection techniques, to examine your methodology, and to offer some edits, to offer some criticism. So they're ideally, and I'm not going to get into it, but in the news there's some huge lapses in this peer review process that recently have been discovered. But ideally, it has been looked at by a number of people. That is the way it's supposed to work. Takes into account new discoveries, again, selects only favorable discoveries, cherry picks data. Science invites criticism. Pseudoscience often, not always, but often would see criticism as conspiracy or as somehow underhanded. In science, results are verifiable. Pseudoscience, again, this is about being able to show someone. You generally can't say, oh yeah, we did this, and take my word for it. That goes against fundamentally the grain of what scientific inquiry is. This one, as I've been looking through some of this, I see this more and more to be true. Scientists, if you listen to their conclusions, they often hedge their bets. They often try to carefully qualify because they don't want to overstate the nature of their conclusions. Now, sometimes if the evidence is overwhelming, they will make stronger statements, but what you see is sometimes even with anecdotal evidence, even with limited evidence, you see broad, wide claims of usefulness. And again, there's a focus on very accurate measurement. In pseudoscience, commonly, they function in generalities, they function in anecdotes. I measured this one thing once, again, which might sound science-y. Sometimes the goal is to sound science-y. And again, why would you want to do that? Why pseudoscience? To seek legitimacy for claims you're making, for conclusions you're making, or sometimes for beliefs that you have. Beliefs where traditional science wouldn't necessarily support what you're saying, but you want it to sound aligned with science and glean the confidence that people often have, not everybody, in science. So in order to what? In order to seek financial gain. And it's always good, I think, to look at people's intentions. It's always good to look at people's agendas. That is a reasonable question to ask. But ultimately in science, we want to come back to the data. We want to come back to the methodology in order to defend or protect very strongly held beliefs. If something somebody else says is going to explode your personal worldview and really attack your self-identity, that's hard to take. So maybe you come up with a science-y sounding response to someone else's science. And again, I'll hold off. So frankly, as I'm think and read on the topic, this is the bullet that I came up with for, among others, flat earthers, okay? Is why would you, in the face of overwhelming evidence contrary to the flat earth hypothesis, why would you continue? And I think that, especially in society today, maybe there is a sense of powerless. There is a sense of anonymity that people want to fight against. They want to have power. They want to be unique. They want to have autonomy and control over their lives. But I don't know, maybe there are other reasons. And again, I'll invite, and again, maybe there are various other reasons. So to come back to some of the individual topics that I brought up, and just to provide a little bit of a context, again, well, so let me start with anti-vaxxers, as they're commonly called. There was an article in 1998 published, and it was in The Lancet, which is a professional medical journal, and it was influential, although they only looked at 12 cases. A very small N for those of you in statistics, a very small sample size. Generalizing to the whole world with a very small sample size is not responsible. And I'm not so intimately familiar that I know about the process and how it got published, but there were 12 co-authors of this paper, and they did not have a control group. So what they did was they looked at the MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine and tried to associate it with autism or autism spectrum-like disorders. And they were, in their article, in their research, they were able to successfully make that case, and it was later completely discredited. It was later retracted by the journal, which is a huge thing for a journal to do. It took them 12 years to retract. But of course, and there was a financial interest found. The lawyers who were, lawyers were funding this research, and the lawyers happened to be people representing lawsuits against vaccination makers. So it caught hold. It, in this case, scared people to death, and it was an idea that caught hold, and for various reasons, there's at least a subset of people who can't let go in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And again, sometimes I can't explain this. In this case, they will point, still, people will point to that article. Technically, the article doesn't exist anymore, but it's still pointed to. And so in some cases, I don't have an explanation, I can't explain, but there is still an effort to align themselves with the science behind it, even though the science has essentially been discredited and evaporated. So this is one. Climate change is near and dear to my heart. This is something I teach in my classes. There is overwhelming evidence by a vast majority of professional, working, expert scientists that the globe is warming, that humans have a very strong influence on that warming, okay? There are contrarians and there are scientists, actually few of whom are climate researchers, few of whom's expertise is actually in the field that they are criticizing, who spend most of their time trying to attack various aspects. So they're not doing, remember one of the things is that science is progressive. You're asking and answering new questions, you're collecting new data. They are not trying to figure out why it's warming or to answer their own questions. They are spending most of their time funded by people with financial interests, which, you know, that's a reasonable concern to have, but there is no science. Ultimately, there is no science. There is pseudoscience. There is argumentation and criticism that doesn't have facts behind it, or individual small situations are cherry-picked. Now, let me say there's another thing here, is in the case of global warming and climate science, many people say, oh, well, you know, okay, so it's warming. You've gotten most people to finally recognize that the data actually indicates warming. But Earth just goes through natural cycles. This is just a natural cycle, okay? So when I hear that, I take a breath. Maybe they're misinformed. Maybe they're being intentionally deceptive. So let me give you an example. I don't know. Let's say when I was 11, I ate some bad shellfish and I got a tummy ache. And then yesterday, I got a tummy ache. Must have been bad shellfish. I didn't go anywhere near bad shellfish yesterday, but do bad shellfish give you a tummy ache? Yeah. Okay. Well, in climate science, we know that in the past, there are drivers of past warming and cooling. We know that. That's understood. You can't say that that evidence applies to the reasons that we are seeing warming now, because there's not evidence now of natural factors leading to warming. But there is a massive amount of evidence of human factors leading to warming, evidence which is essentially ignored in favor of, in this case, applying conclusions completely inaccurately. Well, let me see here. I want to make sure I leave you time. So I'll leave that one alone. Flat earthers, again, overwhelming evidence to the contrary. In the case, by the way, they will call many of you, if you're not a flat earther, you're a glober. Okay, so you globers out there. Yes, yeah. They will invoke vast conspiracies to put forth evidence that Earth is in fact spherical. They will use ever so minimally the scientific method. I saw a YouTube video. Somebody walked to the horizon at the beach and said, held up a straight edge, a ruler, and said, flat. Everybody can see this. Well, from that perspective, you are so zoomed in, you can't see the arc. The arc isn't perceptible to your eyes. It's perceptible to satellites and astronauts, and I can't even get into it. There is overwhelming evidence. They also just make stuff up, okay? The Earth, the sun is a spotlight type feature rather than providing unidirectional energy and light in all directions. There's some sort of brown dwarf star that moves through that is made up. No other professional astronomers know about this star, but flat earthers do. And so that's a sure sign that they're applying pseudoscience. They're trying to align themselves with science in order to get at least some people to believe them. And again, I'm not a nutritional expert, but Dr. Oz, the food babe, and if you can't see there, it says, if a third grader can't pronounce it, don't eat it. And then this woman, who calls herself the science babe, that's not my label, it's theirs, says, don't base your diet on the pronunciation skills of an 8-year-old. In other words, it's not really science to make that claim. Now, maybe there are chemicals we shouldn't ingest, and again, I'm not blanketly attacking what they're saying about nutrition or supplements, but or other behavior, or purchasing his access to his newsletter or whatever you might do. But what I am saying is that there is minimal evidence presented. There is vast claims presented, and there is significant profit to be had. So again, might some of their suggestions be helpful to individuals? Might that have happened to individuals in the past? Sure. Their claims don't hold up to the scientific method. And again, power balance. I want to read here what their claim, one of their claims directly from one of their ads was that they use holographic technology to, quote, resonate with and respond to the natural energy field of the body, unquote. Numerous independent studies of this device found it to be ineffective in enhancing athletic performance, and on and on and on. They paid almost $60 million in damages as the result of a lawsuit of making claims that evidence shows that what we're going to provide you at $11.95 is going to help you and make you a better person. Now, could somebody put it on and personally feel more confident because they got this cool thing that other people have? I don't know, maybe so, but that's not what they're claiming. And one item that's missing, I don't know that I've left enough time to bring it up, but is I am very careful with my students who have a deep faith and might find some things in my class that I would say, or in a geology class or in a biology class regarding evolution, regarding the age of the earth, might find that to be confrontational, invalidating of their faith, and I do not ever want to do that. I want to be respectful of my students, and so when this comes up in my class, I do make the distinction that there is a significant difference between the way that professional expert scientists explore evolution or the age of the earth than how it is explored or explained from a biblical perspective using creation science, which, if you look at the history of this, sort of morphed into the idea of intelligent design. And oftentimes there's evidence used to try to support the conclusions that they already have. That's not science. I'm not invalidating a deeply held emotional connection to the spiritual world as somebody's way of explaining things. I'm saying it's not science. And then when all is said and done, I have heard lengthy scientific discourse about how this came to be or that came to be, in particular with regard to evolution. But in the very end, well, ultimately, from a fairly strict biblical sense, you invoke the miracle of creation. Science doesn't invoke the miracle of creation. So I'm always welcome my students to come talk with me about this. If we're talking about how to understand the world and then make decisions in the public sphere about how we spend our money, I think the fair thing to do is go with the approach that is as objective as possible and that essentially applies to the broadest range of people. So that's my take on this particular aspect. I don't want to label it pseudoscience in any sort of offensive way, but if they're trying to use science and not quite following, quote unquote, the rules, then it's not the scientific method. So that is, and I'm not going to take the time to show this, but if we have time, you definitely want to see it. But I'll turn it over to Lynn for now.
And now what do we do with the...
Yeah, so if you want to use this.
All right.
I'm sorry, there you go. Yours is next, yeah.
So hello. So he had all the really pretty slides, and I don't, because this is just the way I am. Although I work in counseling, my interest in the ideas of science and pseudoscience really comes from my undergraduate and some graduate coursework I did in cognitive neuropsych. So my background is in psychology, although my master's is in counseling. But my interest in this stuff is because science is one of those things that, as John was saying, is always moving forward, right? We're always testing hypotheses, either accepting or discarding information as new, more relevant, or more accurate information exists. So I hit his slides again, just as a kind of a backup. So yeah, science is systematic study, and even in the, quote, soft sciences, of which psychology is often thought to be one, we have hard science, right? We actually do hypothesis testing, replication, all of the kinds of things that you would expect in one of the natural sciences. Pseudoscience, I take a little bit different take on this, and you'll see it in my next couple of slides. In some cases, pseudoscience is science that was understood to be accurate at the time that people were promulgating the ideas based on the best information that they had at the time, and that with new, better information, we find to be not accurate. So in some cases, people are engaging in pseudoscience because they have some other secondary benefit that they hope to gain, like parting you from your hard-earned cash, or becoming famous, which probably parts you from your hard-earned cash in some way as well. And then I added non-science, because there is also non-science, right? And that's the realm, I think, of some of the disciplines that are on our campus that are also extremely important. Music, art, philosophy, humanities, many of those areas of intellectual discovery are not grounded in the scientific method, nor should they feel like they have to be, right? It's a different way of approaching things, right? Another sphere of human knowledge. And as the example, I've got a picture of, this is a skull, in case you weren't aware. There is a group of people in New Guinea called the Foray people, and they engaged in cannibalism. And they ate the brains of the people that they captured. But their belief was that all diseases and ailments are the result of sorcery. Sorcery, right? So were they wrong? Modern science will say, yes, they're wrong. The germ theory of disease shows that they're wrong, but that was their belief system, and it was probably promulgated much the same way as the bad shellfish and the tummy ache overgeneralize, right? So you pair one stimulus with an outcome, and pretty soon those two things are carefully connected. Try it with your dog if you have one. Sit, treat, right? Pretty soon they'll sit. So non-science, pseudoscience, or science. What is phrenology? Anybody know what phrenology is? Yes.
Is it like the skull structure determines intelligence, or?
Yes. No. Well, not intelligence. I'm feeling John's head, because the bumps on his head are telling me all kinds of things about his personality. This happens to be what's called a Fowler head. My name is Lynn Fowler. This is not my creation. But it was.
Are you related at all?
I don't know. I haven't done that part of the genealogy.
Do you have any financial connection?
I do not. I'd like to have a Fowler head, though, so if anyone can find one and feels, compelled to purchase it for me, I would be eternally grateful. But the questions that they were trying to address, right? So people in the mid-1800s, this was a long time ago, before we had the ability to do things like peer inside of a living human being's skull while they're engaging in activities, right? We can do functional MRI testing on people and kind of see in real time how what's happening in the outside world is having an effect on the functioning of your brain, which is a pretty amazing thing. These folks didn't have that. They had this instead, right? They couldn't take the top off your head. That wouldn't have been good, and it usually results in death. So they were trying to answer questions, though. And this is the point that I want to make. When people are engaging in pseudoscience, oftentimes they're really trying to answer real questions. Their methodology is, I would say, flawed. For us, we understand the phrenologist methodology to be flawed in retrospect, right? There were lots of very famous, well-known, real sciencey people who were totally into this phrenology thing because they thought it would help them understand why people acted the way they did, right? We're all interested in understanding why we act the way we act and why other people don't act the way we think they should act, right? Well, if phrenology would have actually worked, it would have been great. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't. So it doesn't make sense now, their methodology. At the time, it did. And in this very small print, and this is one of the things I thought was so, it was heartwarming to me as a person who believes in science. O. Parker Jones, Alfaro Almagro, and Jabati in 2018, so well, actually last year in 2017, they actually took the concepts of phrenology and put them to an empirical test. They compared what phrenologists thought they were able to discern and mapped it onto actual brains and did reviews of functional MRIs to see if there was any correlation. And what do you think they found? Anyone? No correlation. But that's science. They didn't simply dismiss it and say, oh, that's just crazy stuff. They said, I don't know. Maybe they're onto something. Who knows? Let's test it and find out. So they did. And they did. It doesn't. But I'd still like to have the Fowler head. Eugenics is another one, and it comes up periodically because of the outcome, not eugenics itself, but the policies that were instituted. So this guy here, anybody know Francis Galton? Sir Francis Galton, I suppose I should have said. Anybody know what else he's famous for? Because he's famous for other things. He coined the term eugenics, and we'll hit that on the other slide. But again, the question's, what were proponents of eugenics trying to address? Right? Same thing. We're talking about mid-1800s, 150 years ago, almost 200 years ago in some cases, as you go back. They were looking at what people had done with crops, with animal husbandry, with the new understanding of Mendelian genetics, which we don't understand was once new and quite earth-shattering and groundbreaking, the idea of inherited characteristics. They didn't understand genes and gene expression yet, right? It was just starting to be things that they were understanding from experience. If I cross these pea plants with these other pea plants, I get these things. If I cross this animal with this animal, if I cross a donkey and a horse, I get a mule. Okay. All these things are accurate, right? They're true. They actually work. So people thought, what if we could use what we understood about genetics to create healthier people? What if we could selectively breed out things like some disease? Is that a bad thing? Is it a good thing? They thought it was a good thing. Now, there were some people who had some ulterior motives for why they thought it would be a good thing, like, oh, fewer people who can't work, then, lower taxes, right? We don't have to support those people because they won't be here. But some of this stuff makes sense if you think about it from here to here. It's when you start to realm and delve a little further. The issue, as I said, the application of the theory, and we probably all know the worst application of the eugenics theory. Does anybody know what we consider to be the 20th century's worst application of eugenics? The Holocaust. How many people are aware that here in the state of California, people who were confined to state mental hospitals were routinely sterilized until the 1970s? So, yeah, there's a really bad one out there because a whole bunch of people were murdered. But it's closer to home, too. So sometimes it's easier to see the evil when it's a few 100,000 or miles away, but it's harder to see when you think that I grew up in Auburn, and DeWitt was a mental hospital at the time, and people who lived at DeWitt Mental Hospital were sterilized while I was a young person, so it's within my lifetime. So a little frightening. And I'm going to go quickly beyond this. The other thing that he was famous for is, anybody here take statistics? Or teach it. So correlation, chi-square, regression, those are all things that Galton developed. So when we think about people who have promulgated some ideas that turn out very badly, I think it's important to sort of not throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, Galton, that guy was awful because of this thing, when it's not the thing, it's the use to which it's put. And eugenics simply means good birth, right? Anybody think good birth is a bad thing? And to take it to the modern day, we have people now who are working with a tool to modify genes called CRISPR. One of the things that people are doing with CRISPR is trying to edit out genes that cause diseases. So I invite everybody who's thinking, wow, that's a really great thing, to go back and consider, what are the uses to which good tools and good ideas can be put that end up having maybe not good outcomes? There's some other things that are clearly either science, non-science, or pseudoscience. Biorhythms, right? Anybody have a mood ring? I left mine at home. But biorhythms seem to be pseudoscience, except when we start to hear about how our bodies really are tied into circadian rhythms. So it's important to be very critical in the terminology that's being used and dig deeper, right? Are you talking about circadian rhythm, for which there's a great deal of scientific evidence, or are you talking about biorhythms, which is a little bit different? Some of you instructors in the room may be really offended when I tell you that the whole learning styles thing, the visual, auditory, kinesthetic, pseudoscience. I'm sorry, there are preferences for taking in information about the world, but there is no scientific support, as we have defined science, for the idea that people have a style that you should be teaching to. If that was the case, how would a person who's lacking a particular sense ever be able to take in information, right? So things to think about, because we have our firmly held beliefs as well. And then extrasensory perception, we all know that that is science. Right? Absolutely. So again, what features do these share? Right? They're beliefs that people have, they're ways of explaining things about the world that we don't understand. Right? I woke up early one morning with a very strange feeling about being an orphan. And a few hours later, my dad called on the phone, and my mom had been in the hospital. And when she and I talked later, at the moment that I woke up with this startling feeling, she was awake thinking how sad she was that she didn't get to see myself or my brother because she knew she was dying. So it's those strange coincidences that we try to make sense out of, right? And ESP is one of those ways that we try to make sense out of these weird things that happen. And I think that accounts for the persistence of beliefs, right? It helps us feel good. And I have a handout for everybody, and we're getting near to that point where we're just going to have questions. So there's a handout, the 10 Commandments. I believe in using other people's well thought out work and giving attribution. So Scott Lilienfeld, or S.O. Lilienfeld, who's a teacher of psychology and a teacher of thinking about science and pseudoscience and non-science, put together these 10 commandments of helping students distinguish. And I think there are some of the things that, that John had talked about earlier, right? Distinguish pseudoscientific claims from claims that are false, that are just false. The world is not flat. It's just not. We're going to help delineate features that distinguish science from pseudoscience. I think this one's really important, distinguishing skepticism from cynicism. Thinking critically is not the same as starting to not accept any claims, because aren't they all kind of equal in our world of equivalence? Some claims have better evidence than others. So it's important when you're skeptical to not be cynical. I like this. This, I think, is very much a hallmark of what we do in science. Methodological skepticism, meaning I need you to show me more clearly how you came to your conclusions. From philosophical skepticism, I don't believe in that. Right? Or I do believe in this. Therefore, I'm going to be skeptical of anything you bring to me as a claim. I think explaining cognitive underpinnings of pseudoscientific beliefs are important. 7, that whole motivational factor. And some of the motivations are not evil, right? We're not all just trying to make money off of it. I'll sell you those copper fit things. Those are, they're going to change your life. That we should expose you as students to good science as well as pseudoscience. And one of the things that, that he quotes is having an effective understanding of a construct requiring an appreciation of both of its poles, its opposites, right? So it's hard to see good science if you haven't seen poor science, just like it's hard to understand the concept of cold if you don't have an experience of the concept of hot, right? And then the last one for me, at least, is thou shalt be consistent in one's intellectual standards. And for me, that goes back to that VAK, the learning styles concept. I have many colleagues who would be horrified to have sat here and heard me say that learning styles have no scientific support because they know in their own experience working with people that it's true, right? So it's that anecdotal evidence that starts to take over for scientific methodological skepticism. So those I'm going to leave you with these 10 commandments. And you